Hello everyone, my name is Jane Nicholson-Biss. I'm the event manager for the Institute of Leadership and Management. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce Kate Cooper, Head of Research at the Institute of Leadership and Management. Kate, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jane. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Rebecca Bowden today. Although she started her career as a tax inspector, she quickly moved into academia and has devoted her career to exploring all sorts of decisions that are made in organisations, always striving for better ways, more collaborative, fairer ways for decisions to be made. So she's talking to us today about how decisions are made, how better decisions are made, and we're looking forward to hearing from her. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Kate, and welcome to everybody. The Institute of Leadership and Management identifies 5 separate dimensions of great leadership, which are authenticity, vision, achievement, ownership, and collaboration. Each of the 49 webinars focuses on one of the components of each dimension, and they highlight essential learning to assist your leadership development. The 4th dimension of the Dimensions of Leadership webinar series of 49 webinars is ownership. Great leaders take responsibility for their own actions and interactions. They use initiatives and are decisive, solve problems, continuously learn, and are known for their reliability. And this is a kind of attempt to explain the notion of kind of ownership, which is perhaps a strange term to use, but some helpful pointers are here on this slide. Essentially, I take ownership to mean assuming responsibility for leading. And that doesn't mean doing everything and knowing everything, but it means feeling that it's your responsibility to act proactively in order to make things happen. So an important aspect of ownership is decision making, which is what we're going to explore today. And we might kind of think that leaders demonstrate ownership by knowing when to make decisions. And I think probably all of us can think of experiences of being led where we felt very frustrated and unhappy because the people who are supposed to be leading us won't make decisions. They can't act or leave everybody flailing around. And so obviously knowing when to act decisively, knowing when to do things and doing that in a good way is an essential aspect of good leadership. We can think about making decisions in this kind of way, with decision making at the centre, and we can think about sets of tools and techniques and the way in which we implement the decisions we've made and evaluate them. So tools and techniques help us make decisions, and we then need to think about how to implement and evaluate them, and that forms the kind of structure of today's talk. I just want to pause here for a minute though and ask you to bear in mind that there's an important difference between process and procedure here. So processes tend to be open-ended social interactions where everything's contingent, you don't know what's coming next, and you think and evaluate and let situations evolve. And it requires a lot of engagement of the brain, really, and of our social processes and working with colleagues, co-workers. Contrast to that, and I'll make reference to this today, is the notion of procedures. And procedures are very closed, routinized systems for if A, then B. And one of the aspects of decision making that I would urge you to think about is this difference between process and procedure. We can make decisions by procedure, by essentially going down tick lists and boxes and following preset decision paths, or we can make them by process. That is, by using our brains, by thinking about what we're doing, and by regarding it as an open, evolving social process. And I will definitely be stressing to you that processual decision-making rather than procedural decision-making is much to be favoured. As Kate's explained, I'm a university professor, and my particular field of investigation at the moment, my field of research that I concentrate on mostly, is how universities are managed and financed. And I think British universities in particular, perhaps English universities in particular, are to be noted for the fact that they've fallen into the habit of proceduralized decision making. So everything is by tick box, by performance indicators. It's incredibly rigid and predefined and preset. And that's led, I think, English higher education into quite a mess at the moment, because there's very little open flexibility. And I find it ironic that universities, which probably have the best qualified workforce in the UK, tend to make their decisions by sets of rigid procedures rather than actually talking to the people who work in them. And I can contrast that with one of the universities, which is my favourite one to study, which is Mondragon University in the north of Spain, which is a workers' co-op university. The Mondragon cooperatives are fantastic. Huge part of the economy in the Basque region in Spain. And Mondragon University is a fully active workers' cooperative. And my work there, it was quite fascinating. I asked people there how much time they spent making decisions. And they all said they spent about 20% of their time making decisions. And I said, that's a lot of time. And they said, yes, but when we make decisions, they're right decisions, they're good decisions. And anyway, how much time do you and your colleagues spend moaning over at the water cooler about how bad the decisions taken by your management are? So that's the difference between procedure and processual decision making. Okay, moving to the next slide, we come to types of decisions. And the types of decisions listed here, I suppose they tend, certainly the first two, more towards being reactive decision making than proactive decision making. And that's another dimension I'd urge you to think about. To what extent is the decision making a reaction to a problem rather than thinking about what needs to be done and being proactive about that. In terms of routine decisions, it's, I think, always important to bear in mind as a leader that problems aren't necessarily well defined, and that established rules, policies and procedures aren't necessarily the best way of making routine decisions, because they can lead to complacency and they can lead to organisations sleepwalking their way through things. So routine decision making isn't necessarily good decision making, and there's a constant need to renew and refresh and think about what's happening and not lock things into power structures that are actually bad for the organisation. Adaptive decisions, the thing to look out for there, I think, is that smaller problems may not necessarily be well understood. And there's a need in adaptive decision making to have your whiskers out and your ears open and pricked up and kind of think about what decisions do need to be made, and what kind of tweaks and changes to the system do need to be made, and how do things need to be changed. And the third one is innovative decisions, which is where problems are unusual and unclear and creative solutions are required. I suppose my alert to you here would be that you might not even know when you have a problem. And that can be a particular product of procedural thinking and procedural organisations, where they tend to sleepwalk along and think, well, this is how we've done it, and we've always done it this way. And that might lead to a certain blindness to the need to make innovative decisions. Decision making can really be categorised or characterised rather as this kind of 7-stage process, which nothing's this neat and tidy in life, but this is quite a helpful heuristic device to help think about the whole process that's involved. And a lot of my work over the years has involved looking at science and technology and the way in which science and technology is decisions are made about it and the way in which they're influenced. And my own PhD was about new technologies and how decisions were made about the hazards that came from new technologies. And I've been particularly interested recently with the Grenfell Tower disaster, the awful fire in London, and thinking about the decision-making processes that led to the renovation of that block in that way. And I'm going to talk you through these stages here, and maybe bear in mind the Grenfell Tower disaster as an illustration of this kind of decision-making process and the things that you need to be aware of. So it starts at number one with the identification of the problem. And in Grenfell, the identification of the problem was, as far as I understand it, that these blocks of flats weren't very aesthetically appealing to the rather richer people who lived in the area. And also that they were very cold because they were built in the 1960s and the insulation wasn't very good. This led the council to collect information about what might be done. So that's thinking about technical solutions to a technical problem of a building that doesn't look too good and is too cold. That led at number three to identify the options available. And that involved consulting with various builders, contractors, and so on, who might undertake the work so they could identify the options available for improving the building. Now, collecting information, identifying options is quite good, and they're important aspects of it. But in collecting information, the council perhaps had a blindside around what could be done around improving the insulation, improving the aesthetic appeal of the building. And that will have driven them in three to identify the options. So collecting information on, we can cover it up, we can add an extra layer of insulation. Going to three was talking to various contractors to tell us what options we could exercise in order to do that. And they got quotes from the contractors. And at stage four, the evaluation of those options essentially became looking at the quotes and basically deciding which was going to look nicest and which would be the cheapest. And this is often a problem, and I have a background in accounting. This is often a problem with decision making in public sector organisations and of course in the private sector as well, is that cost comes to dominate. And we tend to think more about the efficiency of a decision we make rather than the effectiveness. So in evaluating the options, safety got dropped out. Safety got dropped out and cost became a major evaluating criterion. And then at five, the selection of the optimum solution, basically it went for the cheapest. So this is often a problem with these decision-making processes. Oh, we've got something, that was one of the options, and look, that's the cheapest. And what you've forgotten along the way is all the other criteria that should be coming into your thinking. Number six, you have implement the optimum solution. Well, obviously that was the letting of a contract, and that was undertaken. So that's easy enough. It's often what private sector do is they buy a contract in order to undertake work that they might have undertaken themselves. So councils used to have direct works departments. Now they do this thing under contract with private sector suppliers. And if you're going to have that kind of solution, you need to bear in mind that you need the capacity to understand what your contractor is doing in order to understand whether the optimum solution is actually being implemented. So outsourcing in that way isn't necessarily an easy option for anything. And finally, you need to evaluate the results. So I don't know this, but I suspect at Grenfell, the evaluation of the results, if there was any, would have been in terms of, was this building was it clad? Does it look better? Was the contract to time and within cost? So that's how it will have been done. And of course, the real evaluation of what happened there was the fire, which resulted in more than 80 people losing their lives. So we seem to have a fairly disastrous decision, which is now leading to a whole new cycle of that decision-making process. So that's just to give you an idea of how you can follow all these stages through, but if you set it up wrong, you are heading for disaster. So going on from there, what's good information? And the main aspects of good information are listed there. When you're thinking about what's relevant information, I'd ask you to think about, how do you know what's relevant? And that's important. It's important to regard this as a process rather than a procedure, to ask everybody, to consult everybody, to really kind of think about what's relevant information. In the case of Grenfell, nobody thought that relevant information to factor in was fire resistance. And that's, and the only other aspect I'd add there is cost effective means cost effective to collect. So you need to think about, in terms of making a decision, don't push yourself to the point where you spend all your money actually collecting decision in order to make your decision. And specific, the thing there is what specific information? It is to be specific enough to you to make decisions, but what all of this, what counts as good information, is going to be highly dependent, highly contingent on your formulation of the problem, the formulation of the thing you need to make a decision about in the first place. Now, here's some techniques for evaluating the options that you come up with. Remember that these are only tools. They're best used to aid discussion, to encourage thinking and stimulate analysis. I think these are quite good, these techniques listed here are quite good in order to get people to focus and to have a discussion and to aid that process of decision making. But I think all too easily people fall into procedural decision making where they think, well, you know, the outcomes of the decision matrix is X, so we're doing X, because none of these techniques are foolproof and they're all ultimately dependent upon subjective interpretations and faulty, not terribly accurate information. So, you know, these aren't to be relied on as absolute kind of sausage machine sort of answers where you put everything in and crank the handle and this is, you get the decision out. No excuse for not making a proper decision. I'm just going through them quickly. Pros and cons, very simple, basic one. Really, you need to be consistent in your approach in thinking about this and be aware of biases, conscious or unconscious. Decision matrices, these set the criteria for decision making against the various options that you might have and lets you see in a sort of systematic way which might be best. Once again, do bear in mind that the criteria you set for your decision making and the information that allows you to fill in the boxes on any such matrix is riddled with subjectivity. Decision trees allow you to look at the consequences of things, but do bear in mind that there are always unintended consequences. Again, think of Grenfell. So decision trees, you know, it's the if yes, then here, if no, then this. They let you follow through those kinds of consequences. And again, they let you do it in quite a systematic way, let you map things in a way that lets everybody see it and provides a good basis for discussion. Pareto analysis about finding the greatest return or benefit for the input. You've got problems there around quantification, I would suggest. Paired comparison analysis, which I personally think is inordinately too complicated, again, helps organize thoughts by letting you kind of map things out. I mean, basically, decision matrices, decision trees, Pareto analysis, paired comparison analysis is all about almost a kind of visual mapping that lets you follow things through. And then finally, we've got cost-benefit analysis, which we're going to go into in some more detail. And cost-benefit analysis, as this quote says, is weighing the benefits of something against the costs. The advantages of cost-benefit analysis are, the principle's easy to understand. Do the benefits outweigh the costs? But that simplicity belies a lot of kind of complexity and problems. It is relatively straightforward. I personally don't think it's that objective, because it really depends on the way in which things are quantified. And cost-benefit analysis, one of its great weaknesses is that often the benefits of something are, so it's usually easy to identify the costs because they're usually in financial terms. The benefits can be much less quantifiable and therefore subject to subjective interpretation. It is versatile, it can be used in a lot of different situations and a whole range of options. And one of the earliest examples I found was looking at the options for a third London airport in the 1960s or the 1970s. It does simplify complex business decisions. Everyone can grasp the monetary nature of a decision, but not everything is reducible to money. So just to summarize those disadvantages, it's often difficult to estimate the benefits, particularly revenues, but I would think a whole load of other things as well. It's very hard to put a number on a lot of those things, which can lead to under or overestimation. And obviously that becomes extremely misleading. And so it's several variations of cost-benefit analysis differ in how they define cost and benefit. And I think it's problematic in that it reduces everything to the quantifiable. And I think the best example I can think of here is those of you who are accountants will know this, the case of Ford making a decision about a car called the Ford Pinto in the 1970s, where it had to make a decision about where to put the petrol tank in this car. And it could put, the safest place to put it was straddling the rear axle of the car. The cheapest place to put it was right at the back of the car, just behind the bumper. And the accountants at Ford actually did a cost-benefit analysis of the effect on sales of making the car marginally more expensive by putting a straddle petrol tank over the axle, and the costs of people suing them when they were badly burnt in rear-end collisions. And they decided on that basis to put the petrol tank right at the back of the car, just behind the bumper. The net result of that was a lot of people had very serious injuries from rear-end collisions when the petrol tank ruptured, and Ford was sued, and sure enough, the damages that inflicted on them through the courts from people suing weren't that great. But the reputational damage to Ford was, as you might imagine, absolutely enormous. So it's not necessarily the case that you can quantify all costs and benefits accurately and sensibly. So the Ford Pinto case is one of the best examples of getting that wrong. Very important just to mention, as we go towards the end, that it's doing nothing is always an option, but always beware, don't not make a decision by default or as a result of exercise of power. You know, if you're not going to make a decision, make sure that's an active decision not to make a decision. Implementation of decisions. There's a nice list there of how things are going to be done. I can't fault this list here. I think it's a good list. The chief problem with implementation plans is that that's where organisations often fall down. Certainly the case with universities, that they generally fall down when they decide on a policy and then don't actually set up who's going to do it, how they're going to do it, what resources are they going to do, etc., etc. And the implementation plan is as necessary as the decision making. Monitoring and evaluation, again, monitoring I regard as an ongoing process. monitoring is the sensible stages of monitoring are listed there. My one word of caution about monitoring is that within organisations, especially where there might be a bit of a blame culture, is that people tend to lie, or they tend to cover up what they've done, or cover up the effectiveness or otherwise of what they've done. Best example here is Soviet Russia, the old USSR, which thought it had a wonderful economy because it monitored its decision making in its 5-year plans, but in fact fear of being shot encouraged people to lie outrageously. And so monitoring isn't necessarily going to be completely effective, and you might be deluding yourself. Monitoring should also be a continuous feedback loop. So as you monitor, it should feed back into your decision making so that you can think about how things are going and you can change them as and when necessary, because it's a poor plan that can't be modified, and that applies to decisions. Evaluation is also important, not just for that individual decision that you've made or set of decisions, but also it provides a lot of organisational learning in a wider context, and good leaders would take the lessons learned there much more seriously. Evaluation is problematic because people's careers often depend upon the successful implementation of decisions, and because they want to build their careers, they might be terribly persuaded to sort of beef up the success of what they've done in order to further their careers. And that's something particularly prevalent in UK universities with a student loan system, for instance. Thinking about this critique of a rational model, what presented to you today is a rather kind of rational model of decision making. I think this is quite a nice and very revealing slide, and I think it's one that repays a lot of care and attention and thinking about. And I suppose I would summarise the slide by saying that the assumption of reality is often because of the operation of power in organisations and the inability to reduce everything to a neat set of models and ways of doing things. Also, a good point to think about is the notion of maximising versus satisficing. It's even a hard word to say. The quote there from Rubin, I think, is very good. I think the overall lesson to say here is that the rational model encourages kind of good enough thinking rather than innovative creativity, and above all, risk-taking. And I think one of the big problems with a lot of leadership, because people are judged on results and perhaps judged quite harshly in terms of results, we don't really reward, and this kind of model of decision-making doesn't reward risk-taking, innovation and creativity, which would be the maximising way to do it. And then finally, I would add to this, I love this quote actually, too many leaders avoid making tough calls, etc. I would add to this, too many are bullheaded, too many have too much power, too many do too little consultation and facilitative work with their colleagues and those they learn, so they don't regard it as a collaborative decision making, they think they have to make the call. And there's far too little innovation in decision making, often because we get tied down, locked down into relying on models and techniques, because nobody can criticize us if we follow all the models and techniques. But really great leaders are willing to take calculated risks and to be innovative and creative in what they do. Okay, that's about all I have to say today. I don't know if there are any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. We've actually used up all the 30 minutes, but that was so interesting. I think we've given many people so much food to thought that I'm not surprised that even if we had time for questions, it would put people into information overload, which of course would impair their decisions. So it just remains for me to thank you ever so much for the webinar today, and back to Jane.